that to the poll takers at vivabarneslaw.locals.com. It and Amos Miller are vying for first. So, yeah, we'll start with the Electors Clause case. And this is a case that if you were at vivabarneslaw.locals.com, you're probably familiar with the legal principles involved during the Barnes Law School videos we were doing back at the time of the election controversy and dispute back in November and December and January of 2020 and 2021. So the Constitution provides, under the Electors Clause, that the legislatures of each state will decide how people are represented in terms of federal office. This includes the legislature of the state having exclusive power over how they will pick the president, and the state legislature having power along with Congress over how members of the House and the Senate are selected. The issue has come up before the U.S. Supreme Court because many justices in the past have voiced concerns about what's been happening at the state level, which is state courts are intervening in trying to usurp the power of the state legislature. In particular, in North Carolina, once the state legislature became Republican and the state Supreme Court had a 4-3 Democratic edge, they suddenly decided that their free elections clause of their state constitution gave them, the court, the power to pick how redistricting would take place rather than the state legislature. They repeatedly rewrote the rules according to whatever standards they set, to such a degree that you had 4 political scientists appointed by a court who were affiliated with the Democratic Party and often met in secret with them, actually shaping and writing the districts that people will be elected from in 2022. One of the people they took out through their redistricting was Madison Cawthorn, who lost a large part of his district and then lost in the primaries. So the goal, this case up for the U.S. Supreme Court on whether that is patently illegal, that stripping courts of that power is the goal of the challenge. The Supreme Court has agreed to take the case. Briefing has already occurred. Oral argument is going to occur. And it's a major case that would restore the state legislatures as the source of power, not just in congressional elections, because the implication will be that they have the exclusive power in presidential elections, which will in turn potentially preclude what took place in 2020 from reoccurring again.
Break it down for the I just forgot the word now. The districting, when they recap. What's the word? I just lost it.
Redistricting.
When they redistrict, I know we've talked about it. I'm not totally comfortable with the concept. How does it work? How often do they do it? And what are the criteria for redrawing the bounds of any particular districts?
So the way the Constitution provides is that the legislature of each state, once they're apportioned by the census effectively, which that's a separate dispute that's burgeoning up in the courts because the census somehow accidentally wrongfully determined the population of a bunch of states that just accidentally discriminated against conservative states and favored Democratic states, right? So we'll see if that ever ends up getting wrapped up. When Trump tried to fix the census, they took, Congress went nuts. They sued him. They took all kinds of things because they knew they had control over who was implementing and administering the census. And once again, they used the COVID pandemic because the census was taken in 2020 as the pretext for their errors. But putting that aside, census says, you state Tennessee, here's how many congressional districts you get. Here's how many representatives in the House you get. You always get 2 senators by definition under the Constitution. The senators are elected statewide, so there's no redistricting to be done. But in the case of the House of Representatives, there is. And so the question is, what areas within a state will determine who represents the state and the interests of the state in Congress? So like in Tennessee, it's usually 9 members of Congress. So the Constitution next says exclusively vest the legislature of each state with that power. Now, sometimes the controversy has been, what if the state legislature itself, or by constitutional referendum, gives that power, delegates that power to an independent commission? A split 5-4 U.S. Supreme Court decision says that's okay. That's still legislative power within the meaning of the Constitution. But the 4 dissenting justices thought no. They thought that it always had to be done by the legislature of each state.
Isn't there a principle, delegatis non potest delegare? Would that be a case where the 5 say, by legislative methods, they said they can delegate this to an administrative body or somebody else, where the 4 says no, that it's their power, not theirs to delegate?
Exactly. Because it's the U.S., it's a unique situation where the state legislature is explicitly, effectively kind of created by the U.S. Constitution. Because the U.S. Constitution says the legislative body of each state will be the state that determines the apportionment of how the districting takes place. The redistricting takes place. And typically it takes place every 2 years after a census, but sometimes there's redistricting that occurs in between there too. But typically that's how it works. And but so it's almost a federal constitutionally created body. So the various lawfare folks on the left, once Democrats lost majority control of the state legislature in North Carolina, came up with a novel theory. Their theory is the definition of legislature under the U.S. Constitution is actually dependent upon the state constitution that creates that legislature. And thereby, the state constitution can limit the state legislature, and the state constitution can thereby give powers to either the executive branch or the judicial branch to overrule the state legislature. Many state constitutions include a clause that guarantees free elections. I would note the courts have never been willing to use that to enforce against fraudulent elections. Just a little side point. But the new lawfare theory was that the free elections clause effectively allows the judiciary to overrule the state legislature in redistricting, despite the explicit reference and exclusive power given to them by the U.S. Constitution. And they had always rejected that throughout history, pretty much every state. But once Democrats started losing legislative power in a bunch of these states, courts suddenly saw it totally differently, magically shifted their perspective. And in so doing, suddenly said, no, the electors clause, it doesn't define legislature. Legislature is what our state constitution says. Therefore, our state constitution can restrict our state legislature. Therefore, we can overturn redistricting. And they then also created a new constitutional right no one had ever heard of before, which was that free elections meant no partisan bias in redistricting. That's not at all what, of course, it means, but nor has it historically been applied. And again, Democrats are the masters of redistricting and have been for many, many generations. They're only discovering these when they no longer control the redistricting process. So the North Carolina Supreme Court overturned the state legislature's maps. They came up with all these little standards that just conveniently meant Democrats had better chances of winning House races. So the state legislature went back, came up with a new set of maps. Courts overturned that one. Said, nope, still not good enough. Not getting enough Democrats in there. They appointed 4 political scientists, disproportionately Democrats themselves, of course. There was motions to disqualify them that were ignored by the courts. There were communications between the so-called independent neutral experts and the ex parte communications with the plaintiffs, i.e. Democrats. And they came up with and they wrote the map in secret. So we went from the elected branch in public drafting the maps to 4 political scientists secretly writing the maps, which just accidentally, circumstantially ended up favoring Democrats. So they took the state legislators, and then a bunch of amici joined in this, took this case up to the U.S. Supreme Court, saying the North Carolina Supreme Court doesn't have this power. No North Carolina court has this power. Governor doesn't have this power because the U.S. Constitution exclusively gave it to us for a reason.
Well, let me ask, it's either the obvious question or the dumb question. Who then intervenes to not have oversight, but keep in check and balance the legislature themselves if they decide to do something totally funky?
It's non-reviewable. In fact, this was debated at the time of the founding. Should it be reviewed? The only people who can review the House and the Senate choices is Congress. They have some supervisory role. But essentially, the founders decided we only want the elected legislators to be setting the rules for how electors get appointed and for how members of the House and the Senate get appointed. And Congress's only role will be as to Congress itself. They will have no role outside of what's separately identified over the state legislators' choice of electors. And the point was, if somebody else has that power, then you're giving that power to them. It's either in the hands of the elected representatives or it's not. The remedy, if they misuse their power, is at the ballot box. Now, the other 2 limitations are the 14th Amendment. One I agree with, one I don't. So the 14th Amendment clearly was intended to ensure that the manner in which redistricting was done would not be racially discriminatory. and authorized the Voting Rights Act and other bills, though a lot of those laws end up being misused in my view. But clearly the Constitution did intend that with the 14th Amendment. Now, the other part that the U.S. Supreme Court just made up out of whole cloth is that the 14th Amendment requires one person, one vote. What this did is, like, people have asked, why can't we have a version of the Electoral College within a state if a state chooses to do so? Well, Tennessee long did. Tennessee gave more political weight to rural and small town areas to represent the culture and value of those communities than it did big cities. That meant that it wasn't pure one person, one vote in the apportionment of the state legislature. It was based also on where you happen to live, reflecting the political values of that community. U.S. Supreme Court came and said, no. One person, one vote. Just coincidentally favored urban liberal Democrats, just put it that way, and urban political machines and the urban political establishment, and disfavored the rural small town communities that now could be openly politically discriminated against without protection. But those are the only two restrictions on apportionment. It has to be one person, one vote. It can't discriminate based on race.
Okay, and now, so hypothetically then, or not hypothetically, the courts can intervene if there's itself a constitutional violation in the manner in which the legislature is exercising its powers. Other than that, it's to the legislature, and if people don't like it...
The courts are only, if they're violating one person, one vote, or they're violating racial discrimination, the courts have power. Nowhere else. North Carolina is the one that said, oh, yeah, actually, we do. We can actually decide also whether it's partisan or not.
And so the Supreme Court agrees to take it up. What does that mean procedurally? When is there going to be any movement on this? Before 2024, but after 2022?
Probably after 2022 at this point, because they're operating with these maps. So but before 2024. I mean, the oral argument is coming up. The decision will issue sometime in 2023. So maybe sooner, but definitely by 2023. And my prediction, you've already had Kavanaugh, Roberts, Alito, Thomas, and Gorsuch all voice the opinion that the Electors Clause denies and deprives anyone but the legislature of the state of decisions over redistricting, other than Congress. And so, there's your five. Barrett's an unknown, but my guess is I don't think Barrett would go AWOL in this one. So I think it'll be a 6-3 decision that determines that strips it will end the lawfare of state courts usurping this power. It will also end executive branch agency misconduct in the context of elections. And its biggest impact, in my view, won't just be redistricting. It will establish what I was arguing all the way back in 2020. The state legislature has the exclusive control over how electors are appointed. Congress has no role in that one beyond election contest, which is a separate issue. They have they don't get to oversee those rules at all. They do it over the House and the Senate. They don't over the electors. And by affirming that, it will explain just how illegal the 2020 election, unconstitutional the 2020 election always was.
All right.
We can talk about some of who was up. Are we just on Rumble yet?
Well, I was going to say, I didn't realize we're almost 40 minutes in. People, I know some people don't like it. It's a little less convenient for the chat. We will live with it. Growing pains. And it's my agreement with Rumble anyhow. So it will grow.
I'm following the chat live at vivabarneslaw.locals.com. So if you want to hop in that chat rather than the Rumble chat, go ahead.
And I say, people, pressure on Rumble to fix the bugs is what they need almost. So we're winding it down on Rumble. Links in the pinned comment. And let's do this. 3, 2, 1. I think we're alone now. All right. We are on Rumble exclusively. And when this processes, I'll put the link in the pinned comment in the comment section. Robert, where do we go to from here? What's the...
so let's talk a little election fornication.
Okay. You go. I don't even know where to start on this one.
So the Center for American Renewal, which is a more populist-aligned organization trying to support more populist ideas in the think tank world, one of the few that's legit, unlike America First Policy Institute. America First Legal is very good. That's Stephen Miller. America First Policy Institute is a bunch of corrupt deep state hacks aligned with Jared Kushner and big oil money out of Texas, pretending to be the substitute cabinet for Trump. I mean, Trump, you can't underestimate his foolishness in that regard of thinking they're America First, but they're not. And some of those people affiliated with them use the big tech lawsuits to promote themselves. Those big tech lawsuits that lost quickly because they were poorly drafted. But the Center for American Renewal is a much more legitimate organization. People like Kash Patel, others affiliated with it, and they filed a referral request and a kind of a whistleblower complaint, but it wasn't from inside information, to the Internal Revenue Service. Charles Rettig, who I know from back in the day, it's another story for another day, is what I think about Charlie. But the outlining how Zuckerberg and Zuckbucks, as it came to be known, not only committed election bribery, as identified by the special counsel appointed former Wisconsin Supreme Court Justice in Wisconsin, by co-opting the election machinery, the administrative state regulating the elections in key areas, but also engaged in massive scale $400 billion worth of tax fraud, and did so by disguising his partisan political activity as nonprofit 501c3, nonpartisan, non-political activity.